I worked for my father's company all my life and built it up to $10 million. Then he gave it to my clueless brother. When my little brother started mocking me, I started a business that ruined him. The endless demands of the business, there just wasn't much left to give. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled down, we'd find our way back to each other. But the truth was, things never settled down. Olivia started spending more time on her own, rediscovering old hobbies, reconnecting with friends, and even picking up part-time work at a local art gallery. She seemed happier, more alive, but it also felt like she was slowly pulling away. I noticed it in the little things, how she stopped asking about my day, how her laughter sounded less frequent, and how the silences between us grew longer. Meanwhile, Dad was as demanding as ever. He expected me to give everything to the business, just like he had. If something went wrong at the shop, it was on me to fix it. If an employee screwed up, I was the one who had to deal with it. He never said it outright, but I knew he was grooming me to take over completely one day. That was the plan, or at least it was his plan. Mason, on the other hand, seemed to live a charmed life. Every time he visited, he had some new story about his job in Silicon Valley. Another promotion, another big deal, another reason why he couldn't stick around for more than a couple of days. Dad barely hid his disappointment during those visits, but I could see the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Mason's success wasn't something Dad could take credit for, and that fact ate at him. As for me, I tried to be the good son, the dependable one. I poured everything I had into the shop, hoping it would be enough to earn Dad's respect and maybe, just maybe, make him proud. But no matter how much money we brought in or how many clients we landed, it felt like I was always falling short in his eyes. And then, a few months ago, everything came to a head. It started with Olivia. One night, after the shop had closed and I'd finally dragged myself home, she was waiting for me in the kitchen. She looked tired, but there was a determination in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. "We need to talk, Ethan," she said, her voice steady but firm. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew what was coming before she even said it. "I can't do this anymore," she continued. "I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not. I love you, but I'm not happy. And I don't think you are either." I tried to argue, to tell her that we could fix things, that I'd make more time for us, but deep down, I knew she was right. The business had consumed me, and in doing so, it had consumed us. A week later, Olivia packed her bags and moved into an apartment across town. The house felt emptier without her, but I told myself I didn't have time to dwell on it. The shop needed me, and there was no room for distractions. But the cracks were starting to show. My employees noticed my temper growing shorter, my focus slipping. Even Dad pulled me aside one day and asked if I was up to the task. His words stung, but I brushed them off, determined to prove him wrong. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Mason called. "I'm coming home," he said, his voice unusually serious. "Dad wants to talk to both of us about the future of the business." My stomach dropped. I had no idea what Mason meant, but the thought of him swooping in after years of absence to discuss my future with Dad's business was enough to make my blood boil. It felt like my entire world was unraveling. Olivia, Dad, Mason, the shop. And for the first time in years, I was forced to ask myself a question I'd been avoiding. What did I want? The moment Mason told me he'd seen Olivia with another man, everything inside me froze. My mind raced, but I couldn't seem to focus on any single thought. Instead, 1,000 questions swirled in my head, each one more devastating than the last. "You're sure it was her?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Ethan, I wouldn't be calling if I wasn't," Mason replied, his tone firm but sympathetic. "I didn't want to get involved, but I thought you should know." I muttered a quick thanks and hung up, barely able to process what I'd just heard. Olivia and I had been distant for a while, sure, but I never imagined this. The idea of her with someone else, laughing, talking, looking close, as Mason put it, hit me like a punch to the gut. She'd told me she was in Arizona, visiting her sister. Why would she lie? And who was this guy? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. That evening, I confronted her. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, acting like everything was normal. "Olivia," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "where were you last week?" She looked up, surprised by my tone. "I told you, Ethan. I was in Arizona with my sister." I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of guilt or hesitation. "Are you sure about that? Because Mason called me today. He said he saw you in California. With another guy." Her expression froze for a moment before she sighed and put her phone down. "Ethan, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Because it looks like you lied to me, Olivia. You said Arizona, but Mason saw you in Palo Alto." "Who were you with?" She stood up, crossing her arms. "I wasn't lying. I was in Arizona, for part of the trip. But I went to California for a couple of days, too. And yes, I was with someone. But it's not what you're imagining." "Then explain it to me," I snapped, the frustration bubbling over. She took a deep breath, avoiding my eyes. "He's a friend. Someone I met through the art gallery. We've been talking a lot lately, and I needed someone to talk to. Someone who isn't you." Her words felt like a slap in the face. "Why couldn't you talk to me?" "Because you don't listen, Ethan," she shot back. "Every time I try to tell you how I feel, it's like talking to a brick wall. All you care about is the shop, your dad, keeping this business running. And I'm just here, waiting for you to notice me." I stood there, stunned. "So, what? You decided to find someone else to notice you?" "It wasn't like that," she said softly, her voice cracking. "I'm not proud of how I handled things, but I needed space. And honestly, Ethan, I don't even know if we're happy anymore." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. As much as I wanted to argue, to deny what she was saying, I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew she was right. But that didn't make it hurt any less. "I think we need to take a step back," Olivia said after a long silence. "Figure out what we really want. Because this isn't working." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The woman I'd built a life with for 15 years was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. That night, she slept in the guest room. I stayed up late, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong, and whether it was already too late to fix it. Business, while Mason took off for college in California. At first, I was proud of him. He was chasing something bigger, something different. But the more I stayed behind, grinding away at the shop, the more I realized how different our lives had become, and how much Dad seemed to admire Mason for leaving, even if he'd never admit it. For years, I told myself it didn't bother me. I was doing the hard work, building something tangible, while Mason was off in some high-rise office talking about startups and stock options. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much I sacrificed, no matter how much blood, sweat, and tears I poured into the shop, I'd never be enough for Dad. And now, standing in the kitchen with Olivia, my marriage crumbling and Mason suddenly playing the role of whistleblower, I felt the weight of everything I'd been holding on to for years. "What the hell do you mean, it just happened?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You don't just stumble into someone else's arms, Olivia. You made a choice to lie to me, to betray me." She sighed, crossing her arms. "Ethan, I'm not going to stand here and justify it. I told you, we haven't been happy for a long time. I've tried talking to you, but you never listened. All you cared about was the shop, your dad, keeping this life you think we're supposed to have. I needed more. More." I repeated, incredulous. "I've given you everything. I've sacrificed for you, for us. And this is how you repay me." She looked away, her expression unreadable. "I didn't ask you to sacrifice anything, Ethan. That was your choice." Her words hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but nothing came out. Because deep down, a part of me knew she was right. The shop had consumed me. I'd let it define me, shape every decision I made, and push aside everything else in my life, including her. But that didn't make her betrayal any easier to swallow. I stormed out of the kitchen, unable to look at her any longer. I needed space, time to think, but there was no escape. Everywhere I turned, I was reminded of the cracks in my life. The shop, Olivia, Mason, Dad. It felt like the walls were closing in, and for the first time, I didn't know how to fix it. Later that day, Mason called again, his voice casual, like nothing had happened. "Hey, Ethan. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." I almost laughed at the irony. "You want to check in? Really?" After dropping that bombshell about Olivia, Now you want to act like we're buddies. Look, he said, sighing. I didn't tell you to stir the pot. I told you because you deserved to know. And I've been thinking about something else. Dad wants to have a meeting, about the shop, about the future. He called me yesterday. I clenched my jaw. Of course Dad had called Mason. The golden boy. The one who'd walked away from the shop and still managed to be Dad's favorite. What's there to talk about? I said bitterly. I'm already running the damn place. I don't know, Mason replied, his tone cautious. But I think it's serious. He wants us both there. Hanging up the phone, I felt a fresh wave of frustration. First Olivia, now Mason and Dad. It was like my whole world was spinning out of control. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could keep it all together. Like I'm just the stand-in until the real son decides to grace us with his presence. Olivia gave me a sympathetic look but didn't say much. She had heard this rant before, and we both knew there wasn't anything she could say that would make it better. The truth was, it wasn't about Mason, or at least, not entirely. It was about Dad. No matter how hard I worked or how much I sacrificed, it always felt like I was running a race I could never win. The next morning, I went back to the shop like always. The contract with Harper Construction was a big deal, and I should have felt proud of what I'd accomplished. But Dad's dismissive response lingered, souring the victory. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that sting of rejection. I could think of dozens of moments over the years when I'd done something I thought was worth celebrating, only to be met with indifference. It didn't matter if it was landing a new client, improving the shop's efficiency, or even expanding the staff. To Dad, it was just business as usual. But when Mason came home for the holidays with stories about his latest promotion or a big project he'd worked on, Dad would light up like a Christmas tree. He's got a good head on his shoulders, that boy, Dad would say, grinning ear to ear. Smart as a whip. Meanwhile, I was sitting there, covered in grease and exhausted from another 12-hour day, wondering what it would take for him to see me the same way. The thing is, Mason didn't even want Dad's approval. He didn't care about the business, the legacy, or any of it. He was perfectly happy living his life out west, far away from the shop and all the baggage that came with it. I was the one who stayed, the one who kept things running, the one who sacrificed. And yet, it was never enough. One evening, after another long day at the shop, I found myself scrolling through pictures of Mason's latest vacation on social media. He and his girlfriend, some model type with a perfect smile, were sipping cocktails on a yacht in the Mediterranean. It was the kind of life I couldn't even imagine, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of jealousy. Not for the lifestyle itself, but for the freedom Mason seemed to have. He didn't have to deal with Dad's expectations or the constant grind of the business. He didn't have to feel like he was never good enough. And that's when it hit me, I wasn't angry at Mason. I was angry at myself. I'd spent my entire adult life chasing something I might never get, Dad's approval. And in doing so, I'd let the shop consume me, leaving little room for anything else. As I sat there, staring at Mason's pictures, I started to wonder, was it even worth it? Was this the life I wanted? Or was I just trying to live up to a version of success that wasn't mine to begin with? The room seemed to close in around me, every word from Dad's mouth hitting like a hammer. I wanted to say something, to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, and my chest burned with a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. Wait, I finally managed to choke out, cutting through their conversation. You're giving the business to Mason? Dad turned to me, his expression as calm and matter-of-fact as if he'd just announced what was for dinner. That's right, he said. It's time to keep it in the family. I am the family, I shot back, my voice shaking. I've been here, Dad. I've been running this place for years while Mason's been off living his life. He doesn't even want it. Mason raised his hands defensively. Whoa, Ethan. I didn't ask for this. I'm just as surprised as you are. But that didn't matter. He didn't have to ask. Dad had made his choice, and that choice wasn't me. Dad leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Look, Ethan, I know you've worked hard, and I appreciate everything you've done. But Mason has the skills to take this business to the next level. He understands things like finance and strategy, things you don't. His words stung more than I thought possible. After everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, I wasn't good enough. Not smart enough. Not capable enough. Are you kidding me? I said, my voice rising. I've been running that shop for years. I've brought in clients, landed contracts, expanded the business. And you're telling me that's not enough? That I'm not enough? Dad didn't flinch. This isn't about feelings, Ethan. It's about what's best for the business. And Mason. I stood up abruptly, cutting him off. Mason doesn't even want it. He doesn't care about the shop, Dad. He never has. But sure, hand it over to him. Let him learn while I clean up the mess. That's what you want, isn't it? For me to be the backup, the safety net, just like always. Mason started to speak, but I didn't give him the chance. And you, I snapped, turning to him. You've got some nerve coming in here like this. You don't even want the shop, but you'll take it because Dad says so? Because you think you can just waltz in and figure it out while I keep doing all the work. Ethan, calm down, Mason said, his voice firm but not unkind. I didn't ask for this. I don't even know if I want it. But you won't say no, will you? I shot back. Because it's easier to just go along with Dad's plan and let me pick up the pieces. Dad slammed his hand on the armrest of his chair. That's enough, he barked. I've made my decision, and that's final. This is about what's best for the business, not your ego. I stared at him, stunned into silence. My ego. That's what he thought this was about. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my head spinning. I could hear Mason calling after me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I needed to get out of there before I said, or did, something I couldn't take back. By the time I got home, the anger had turned to exhaustion. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my hands, covered in calluses and grease stains from years of work. Work that, apparently, didn't mean anything. For the first time in my life, I asked myself a question I'd never dared to before. What if I walked away? What if I left the shop, the legacy, and Dad's impossible expectations behind? The thought scared me, but it also felt liberating. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop living for Dad and start living for myself. Couldn't let go. The shop wasn't just a business to me, it was my identity. It was the one thing I'd poured my blood, sweat, and tears into for over a decade. Walking away felt like admitting defeat, like everything I'd worked for was meaningless. I looked at Olivia, searching her face for some kind of reassurance, but all I saw was exhaustion. She wasn't angry, she was tired. Tired of the arguments, tired of the shop, tired of the weight it put on our lives. This isn't about Mason, she continued, her voice softer now. It's about you, Ethan. You've been miserable for years. And if you don't see that, then maybe you don't know yourself as well as you think you do. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew she was right. I had been miserable. The shop, Dad, Mason, it had all become too much. But letting go wasn't that simple. What am I supposed to do, Olivia? I asked, my voice cracking. If I walk away, then what? Who am I without the shop? You're more than that place, Ethan, she said, stepping closer. You just don't see it yet. But I do. You could be so much more if you stopped letting it drag you down. I sat down heavily at the table, running a hand through my hair. The idea of walking away felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. But staying meant more of the same, more frustration, more sacrifices, more feeling like I wasn't enough. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollow. Olivia's words echoed in my head, and for the first time, I seriously considered what life would look like if I walked away. Later that day, I finally confronted Dad. I found him in the shop, tinkering with an old engine like nothing had happened. Dad, I said, my voice firm. We need to talk. He looked up, his face unreadable. What is it? I've been thinking, I began, forcing myself to stay calm. If Mason wants the shop, fine. Let him have it. But I'm done. I'm not going to stick around and be his backup, his safety net, or your second choice. Dad frowned, setting down his wrench. You're really just going to walk away? Why not? I shot back. It's what you've wanted all along, isn't it? For Mason to take over? Well, now you've got your wish. He didn't respond right away, just stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "You've put a lot into this place, Ethan," he said finally. "Are you sure you want to throw it all away?" "I'm not throwing it away," I said, my voice steady. "I'm choosing to live my life. For me. Not for you, not for Mason. Just me." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. But if it was there, he didn't let it show. "Suit yourself," he said gruffly, turning back to the engine. I walked out of the shop, my heart pounding. It wasn't the reaction I'd hoped for, but it didn't matter. I'd made my decision. When I got home, Olivia was waiting for me. "How did it go?" she asked cautiously. I shrugged, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. "He didn't fight me on it. I think he was expecting it." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm proud of you, Ethan." For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, and I didn't have all the answers yet. But for the first time, I wasn't living for someone else. I was living for me. Firm. This isn't up for debate. I stared at him, feeling a mix of rage, betrayal, and utter disbelief. "Not up for debate," I said, my voice shaking. "Do you even hear yourself? I've been here for 10 years, Dad. 10 years. I've given up everything for this place. My time, my marriage. And you're just going to hand it over to Mason like I'm nothing." Dad sighed, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't about you, Ethan. It's about what's best for the family." "Best for the family," I repeated, practically spitting the words. "You mean best for Mason? Let me guess, this was his idea." Dad shook his head. "Mason didn't ask for this. I made the call because it's what makes sense. Mason's got kids to think about, a wife who depends on him. He needs stability, and this business can give him that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "And what about me? I'm supposed to just keep working here, doing all the heavy lifting while Mason reaps the rewards." "I expect you to do what's right for the business," Dad said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I stood there, fists clenched, feeling like I was about to explode. "What's right for the business?" I repeated, my voice rising. "What's right for the business is giving it to the person who actually cares about it, who's been running it for the past decade. Not someone who doesn't even want it." Dad didn't respond. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought about storming out, but something stopped me. I wasn't done. "You know what, Dad?" I said, my voice cold. "You're right about one thing. This isn't about me. It's about you. It's always been about you. About your legacy, your idea of what this family should be. Well, guess what? I'm done living for your approval. You want to give the business to Mason? Fine. But don't expect me to stick around and clean up the mess." I turned and walked out of the office, slamming the door behind me. My chest felt tight, my hands trembling with anger. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do next, but one thing was clear: I couldn't stay. When I got home, Olivia was waiting for me, sitting at the kitchen table with a concerned look on her face. "Ethan," she began, but I cut her off. "Not now, Olivia," I said, collapsing into a chair. She stood and poured me a glass of water, setting it in front of me before sitting down across from me. "What happened?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Dad's giving the business to Mason." Her eyes widened. "Mason? Are you serious? He doesn't even—" "Yeah," I interrupted bitterly. "He doesn't even want it. But that doesn't matter, because in Dad's eyes, Mason is perfect. He's always been perfect. And me? I'm just— what? A placeholder. A backup." Olivia reached across the table, placing her hand on mine. "Ethan, I know this hurts, but maybe this is your chance to let go. To start over." I looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She'd been telling me this for years, but I'd never really listened. Maybe I didn't want to. But now, after everything, I was starting to wonder if she was right. Maybe it was time to walk away. To stop fighting for something that would never be mine. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to figure out who I was outside of that shop, outside of Dad's shadow. For the first time in a long time, I let myself consider what life could look like if I stopped chasing his approval. And for the first time, it didn't seem so impossible. And now it was being ripped away, handed to someone who didn't even want it. Every time I thought about Dad's words, the anger bubbled up again, hot and unrelenting. It wasn't just about the shop, it was about everything. Years of sacrifice, years of doing the work no one else wanted to do, years of proving myself over and over, only to be dismissed like I didn't matter. I felt like a stranger in my own life. The shop had been my anchor, my purpose. Without it, I didn't know who I was or what came next. And the idea of staying on to help Mason transition was laughable. Help him? Why should I? He didn't deserve it. Olivia tried again one night, sitting across from me at the dinner table while I stared blankly at my untouched plate. "Ethan," she said softly, "you can't keep doing this to yourself." I didn't respond. "Listen to me," she continued. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But sitting here, letting it eat away at you, it's not going to change anything. You need to decide what you're going to do." "What I'm going to do?" I snapped, looking up at her for the first time in days. "What can I do, Olivia? Dad's made his decision. Mason's getting the shop, and I'm just nothing." "You're not nothing," she said firmly, leaning forward. "You're more than that shop, Ethan. You always have been. But you're so wrapped up in trying to prove something to your dad that you can't see it." I wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but the truth was, she did. She'd been saying the same thing for years, and I'd ignored her every time. "I don't know how to walk away," I admitted finally, my voice barely a whisper. She reached out and took my hand. "Then don't think of it as walking away. Think of it as starting over. You deserve a life that's yours, Ethan. Not your dad's, not Mason's, yours." Her words stuck with me long after she went to bed. I sat there in the quiet of the living room, staring at the walls, letting her voice echo in my head. A life that's mine. What did that even look like? The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep letting Dad and Mason dictate my life. I called the shop and told them I wouldn't be coming in. Then, I started making calls of my own, looking into opportunities I'd never let myself consider before. Jobs outside the family business. Positions where my skills could be appreciated, where I could build something new. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate. But bit by bit, I started to see a way forward. A way to let go of the anger, the resentment, and the constant need for approval that I was never going to get. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Lifted a finger for the business. Was handed everything on a silver platter just because he was Mason. And it was about the fact that my entire life, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the blood and sweat I'd poured into that shop, meant nothing in the end. As Mason walked out the door, I stood there, staring after him, feeling like I'd been gutted. I wanted to yell, to slam the door, to let him know just how much damage had been done, but I couldn't. My anger had burned itself out, leaving only an empty, aching void. For the next few days, I avoided the shop completely. I didn't want to see Mason fumbling his way through, taking over. I didn't want to see Dad pretending this was all for the best. And I definitely didn't want to deal with the pitying looks from the employees who'd known, just as well as I had, who really kept the place running. Instead, I threw myself into, well, nothing. I sat at home, staring at the walls, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. Olivia tried to get me to talk, to pull me out of my spiral, but I couldn't. Every time I thought about starting over, the weight of it all came crashing down again. How do you start over when everything you've ever known has been taken from you? One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a beer and trying to drown out my thoughts, when Olivia sat down across from me. "You can't keep doing this, Ethan," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Doing what?" I muttered, not looking up. "This," she said, motioning to the empty bottles on the table. "Sitting here, wallowing. Blaming Mason, blaming your dad, blaming yourself. It's not going to change anything." I slammed the bottle down harder than I meant to, the sound echoing in the quiet kitchen. "What do you want me to do, Olivia? Just walk away. Pretend none of this matters." "No," she said, her tone unwavering. "I want you to figure out what does matter. Because right now, you're stuck in this loop, trying to hold on to something that's already gone." Her words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. She was right, of course. The business, Dad's approval, the life I'd built around it, it was gone, or at least it wasn't mine anymore. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove out to the lake where I used to go as a kid. It was quiet there, the kind of place where you could actually hear yourself think. I sat on the edge of the dock, staring out at the water, and let myself feel everything I'd been pushing down. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, the crushing weight of not being enough. And then I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. What now? For the first time, the answer wasn't about Dad or Mason or the shop. It was about me. What did I want? What kind of life did I want to build, now that I wasn't tethered to the family business? It wasn't an easy question to answer, and I didn't figure it all out that day. But sitting there, listening to the water lap against the dock, I realized something important. I didn't have to have all the answers right away. What mattered was that I was finally asking the right questions. By the time I left the lake, I felt a tiny flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the first step. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving toward something that was mine. Unable to sit there and listen to him justify his betrayal any longer. The anger, the hurt, the years of pent-up frustration boiled over, and I couldn't hold it back anymore. "You know what, Dad?" I said, my voice trembling but rising with every word. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself to you. I've given everything to that shop, everything, and for what? So you can hand it all to Mason because he can't handle his own life? Because he needs you to take care of him while I'm left to pick up the pieces?" Dad flinched but didn't say anything, which only fueled my anger. "I'm done," I continued, my voice breaking. "I'm done trying to live up to your impossible standards. Done trying to earn your approval. Because no matter what I do, it's never going to be enough for you, is it?" He looked up at me then, his face lined with guilt and something that almost looked like sadness. "Ethan," he began, but I cut him off. "No," I said, shaking my head. "You don't get to explain this away. You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I'm done with you. I'm done with Mason. I'm done with all of it." The room went quiet. Dad sat there, staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I'll figure out my own life," I said, my voice steadier now. "But don't expect me to be a part of yours anymore. You don't get to have it both ways, Dad. You don't get to push me aside and then show up here like this." He looked up at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Ethan," he said quietly. "I thought I was doing what was best for everyone." "Well, you weren't," I replied, my tone flat. "And now you're going to have to live with that." Without another word, Dad stood up and made his way to the door. He hesitated for a moment, like he wanted to say something else, but then he just nodded and walked out. As the door closed behind him, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, mixed with a deep, aching sadness. It was over. The fight, the struggle, the years of trying to prove myself, it was all over. I sat back down, staring at the nearly empty bottle of whiskey in front of me. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, stewing in anger and resentment. Dad was right about one thing. I was strong. Strong enough to start over, even if it scared the hell out of me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to live for him, or for Mason, or for anyone else. I was going to figure out who I was without the shop, without the weight of Dad's expectations. And maybe, just maybe, I'd finally find some peace. Stood up and said, "If you're starting a new shop, Ethan, I'm coming with you." I blinked, caught off guard. "Joe, are you sure? You've been here almost as long as I have." Joe nodded, his expression resolute. "I've seen how much you've done for this place, and I've seen how little you've gotten in return. If you're starting fresh, I want to be part of it. You're the reason this place is what it is, and I trust you to build something even better." His words hit me harder than I expected. Over the years, I'd always thought of myself as just a cog in the machine, but hearing that kind of faith from someone I respected, it lit a spark in me I hadn't felt in years. As the word spread among the crew, a few more of the guys pulled me aside, telling me they wanted in. They were tired of the uncertainty under Dad and Mason's leadership, tired of feeling overlooked. They believed in me, and for the first time, I started to believe in myself too. With their help, we got to work on the new shop. The old warehouse wasn't much to look at, but it had good bones. We scrubbed it clean, patched up the roof, and installed the equipment we'd need to get things running. It was a lot of work, but it felt different this time. Like every nail hammered, every wire run, was laying the foundation for something truly mine. Olivia stopped by one afternoon while we were working. She brought lunch for the crew and stood off to the side, watching as we turned the space into a real shop. "This is good for you," she said quietly as we stood outside, watching the guys unload a shipment of tools. I nodded. "It feels right." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've got a lot of people counting on you, Ethan. Don't forget to take care of yourself too." Her words stayed with me, even after she left. I knew she was proud of me, but there was something in her tone, a distance I couldn't quite ignore. I wondered if she was waiting for me to fall back into old habits, to let the shop consume me the way the old one had. But this time, I was determined to do things differently. By the time we officially opened, the shop was unrecognizable from the run-down warehouse I'd first walked into. It wasn't flashy or perfect, but it was ours. And when the first customers started rolling in, old clients who had followed me from the original shop, as well as new ones who'd heard about us, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about proving anything to Dad or Mason anymore. This was about me, about the future I was building with my own two hands. And for the first time, it felt like enough. "Need to talk, Ethan," he said, his tone lacking its usual gruffness. I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone, debating whether to even entertain this conversation. But curiosity, or maybe the tiniest sliver of compassion, won out. "What do you want, Dad?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. There was a long pause on the other end before he finally spoke. "I made a mistake." That admission caught me off guard. Dad wasn't the type to admit he was wrong about anything. "Go on," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I thought Mason could handle it," he continued, his voice weary. "I thought he'd rise to the occasion, that he'd figure it out. But I was wrong. The shop's failing, Ethan. We're drowning." I leaned back in my chair, the bitterness rising in my chest. "And what do you expect me to do about it?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know you could fix this, if you wanted to." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything, he was coming to me now, asking for help? The anger bubbled up again, hot and unrelenting. "Why should I help?" I snapped. "You made it clear I wasn't good enough. You handed everything to Mason, and now you're coming to me to clean up the mess." Dad sighed heavily. "I made the wrong choice, Ethan. I see that now. And I'm sorry. I should have given the business to you from the start." His apology felt too little, too late. But as much as I wanted to throw it back in his face, there was a part of me, a small, stubborn part, that still cared. Not for the shop, or even for Dad's approval, but for the legacy that I had helped build. "I don't need your apology, Dad," I said finally. "But I'll tell you this. I'm not coming back to fix your mistakes. I've built something of my own, something better, and I'm not giving that up for you or Mason." There was a long silence on the other end before he spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I understand. I thought I'd ask." I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. The conversation left me feeling unsettled, a mix of vindication and sadness swirling in my chest. I had spent so long wanting to hear those words from Dad. "I made the wrong choice, I'm sorry," but now that they'd come, they felt hollow. That night, I sat in the quiet of my new office, reflecting on everything that had happened. The truth was, I didn't need Dad's validation anymore. My shop was thriving, my crew was loyal, and my clients trusted me. I had built something better, something that was mine. As for Dad and Mason, they would have to figure things out on their own. I wasn't their backup plan anymore, and I wasn't looking back. For the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from Dad's expectations, free from Mason's shadow, and free to live my life on my own terms. "You, no matter what." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Mom had always been a quiet presence, the peacemaker in a family full of conflict. I had spent so much of my life focused on Dad's disapproval and Mason's indifference that I hadn't stopped to consider her perspective. How hard it must have been for her to watch everything unfold and feel powerless to change it. "Thanks, Ma," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. But for the first time, it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt comforting. Like I wasn't as alone as I'd always thought. After dinner, As I was getting ready to leave, Mom stopped me at the door. "Ethan," she said, her voice hesitant, "don't let all of this anger consume you. You've worked too hard to let it ruin what you've built. You deserve to be happy." I nodded, her words sinking in as I walked to my truck. She was right. I had spent so much time being angry, at Dad, at Mason, at the world, that I hadn't allowed myself to focus on the good things I had accomplished. The business Dad had built was gone, but mine was thriving. The family dynamics might be broken, but I had forged new relationships with my crew, my clients, and even Mom. For the first time, I saw the possibility of moving forward, not in the shadow of my family's expectations, but in the light of my own hard work and determination. The next day, I walked into my shop with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't working to prove anything to anyone anymore. I was working for myself, for my team, and for the life I wanted to build. And for the first time, that felt like enough. No matter how hard I tried, her words hit me harder than I ever expected. For so long, I had been craving some kind of validation from Dad, just a sign that I was good enough. But when I sat there with Mom, something clicked. I realized that I didn't need it anymore. I had always had her support, and that was more than enough. As the months went by, my business kept growing. We landed more contracts, brought in more people, and expanded our operations. It wasn't always smooth sailing, but it felt worth every challenge. For the first time in years, I finally felt like I was in control of my own life. And it wasn't just my career that was improving. My personal life was getting better too. After Olivia and I divorced, I swore off relationships for a while. The pain of losing her, combined with the stress of running the business, left me drained and empty. But then I met Sarah, and she was different. She was smart, funny, and supportive in a way I hadn't experienced before. We took things slow at first, just hanging out and getting to know each other. But before long, I found myself thinking about a future with her, something I hadn't done in ages. One evening, while we were sitting on the porch of my new house, a big step in my fresh start, I turned to her and said, "I think I want to marry you." She looked at me, surprised at first, then a smile spread across her face. "I think I want to marry you too," she said, leaning in for a kiss. It was simple, quiet, and perfect. After everything I had been through, the betrayal, the anger, the loss, I had finally found peace. My business was thriving, my relationship with Mom was stronger than ever, and I had a woman by my side who made me believe in love again. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in the shadow of the past. I wasn't trying to prove myself to Dad or compete with Mason. I was just living life on my own terms, and damn, it felt good.